You're listening to Overdoing It, the Rhode Island Library Podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of Overdoing It, where our team of library workers dish about their latest reads, views, and passions, alongside fascinating conversations with local luminaries. I'm your host, Meg Hamlin-Black, civic literacy enthusiast, and my pronouns are she, her. Let's dive in and discover who our guest is today.
I'm Rebecca Davis. I'm the co-director and co-producer of Join or Die. It is a film about why you should join a club and why the fate of America depends on it. It's a movie that I produced with my younger brother, Pete. So we were co-producers on this project. And the film follows the story of Harvard social scientist Robert Putnam and kind of takes the audience along on the journey of his research over these last decades into American civic decline. And most importantly, what we can do about that decline to turn around some of those numbers.
I'm so excited to talk to you about the documentary. But first, let's get started, as we always do, with what have you been reading?
I'm actually rereading the Roland Barthes book, Camera Lucida.
Okay.
I've been doing a lot of thinking about the physicality of objects, especially as the conversation, is increasingly turning to kind of like AI and our technological future. And so I've really been enjoying kind of revisiting. It was a book I read in college where I was a photography major, and I've been thinking a lot about kind of like the physicality of material, which I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir as a librarian here, but kind of thinking about that physicality of photographs and how to kind of think about that in our moment now where we're living inside of just a flood of images, every day on our phones. And so I've really been enjoying digging back into that one. So it's a reread. Yeah.
Okay. I love a reread.
Yeah. Camera Lucida.
Okay. Nice. I just finished a great fiction book, Woodworking by Emily St. James. It's her debut novel. And that was really good. And then I've also been reading for the last few months, The Memory Palace, which is a collection of short stories, nonfiction short stories. So yeah, that's been interesting.
Yeah, very cool. Does the woodworking book kind of play on some of those themes of kind of physicality of objects also, or?
Well, what's really interesting is it's about, so the protagonist is it's a coming of age story, but of a 35-year-old trans woman coming out as trans, and this desire to fade into the woodwork, which is an expression I hadn't heard before. And so that was really interesting
metaphor. Yeah.
Right. I thought that was really beautiful. Thinking about physicality of images, does it get into like the mortality rate of digital images or digital in general?
No, the book, it came out like in the early 1980s, and it was kind of like a piece of kind of guidance for how to look at photography, especially as it was, coming into several decades as it had kind of come into the fine art world, which took a long time for photographs to kind of break into the gallery space. Yeah. So it was a book that came out, well before, I'd be curious to hear, I think Roland Barthes has passed by now, but would be curious, like so many of these folks that were critiquing, decades ago, kind of, what their view on kind of the world that we live in now would be.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So it's an older book.
Yeah. I ask because I used to work in a library where our oldest book was from the 1700s.
Yeah.
And people come in like, oh, aren't these all digitized now? It's like, oh, no, they're not. But also thinking about the mortality rate of technology.
Yeah.
And so here's a book that's almost 300 years old.
Yes.
But like my brother recently came across some of the mixed CDs I made him in undergrad. And he's like, I have nothing to play these on.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think these are big questions that we should all be asking ourselves, especially when, those objects kind of contain our history and shared collective knowledge that we want to be passing on generation to generation. And, it was a big part of our film, almost, probably a third of our film is archival material that, we were able to get, thanks to a lot of library systems, honestly, around the country, including, the Library of Congress, our national library, that has such a rich collection of, documents of American community life.
Yeah, I love that. Um, so typically at this point, the next question is like, what are you watching? So are you watching anything particularly exciting right now?
Yeah, interestingly, maybe I actually do not watch a lot of like screens at home, and I don't know if that's because in my working day, I'm watching a lot of footage, when I'm editing a film. But I did actually go to the movies last night, and I saw the film Sentimental Value, which is a new Joachim Trier. He's a Norwegian filmmaker. He recently also made the film Worst Person in the World, which was pretty, widely well received. But so this is his latest film. It's
Oh,
called
cool.
Sentimental Value, and it's kind of a story of generational trauma, kind of told through the main character of a house, kind of a family home.
Oh, interesting.
Again, I think, drawn to that kind of physicality of
Yeah.
objects and their connection to kind of memory. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds really good.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, yeah, let's dive into the fun stuff. So, a year ago, the Rhode Island Center for the Book and this really cool community wealth building organization called Local Return hosted a screening of Join or Die at our local library. And I dragged my parents to the 9 a.m. viewing of it. And it was everything I needed in this moment. And so you started to give a brief summary of the documentary when you gave your intro. But do you want to kind of talk about like how it came to be? And like,
Sure.
I know that Pete, your brother, took Bob's class. And so there was some connection there. But if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, totally. And thank you for helping to fill seats at a 9 a.m. showing of our film. That is, probably not an easy one to get crowds out to. So appreciate you being there for that. And I do remember that Rhode Island Festival Book screening, and we were excited to be part of that. So my brother Pete and I, and for anyone listening who's seen the film or does go see it, you'll meet Pete in the film. He appears kind of throughout the film. He was a student of Robert Putnam, author of the book Bowling Alone, which came out in 2000, and kind of was looking at these like declining trends in civic life and civic participation. We weren't joining things like bowling leagues and the Rotary Club and gardening organizations and religious institutions and unions. So he was kind of charting all of those declines and really trying to raise an alarm bell that this wasn't going to be good for our democracy, because it is in these institutions that we learn how to work together and build common bonds with our neighbors. So our hope in approaching Bob together about being in this documentary was to kind of revisit this famous book, Bowling Alone, which had come out in 2000, 20 years later. So we approached Bob in 2017 together. It was the year he was retiring from teaching. So it was kind of this like now or never moment, like let's try to capture him, capture Bob's last class and see if we can, film in this class that, my brother had been fortunate enough to get to take, 10 years earlier. But can we distill that class into a documentary film and share it, with everyone around the country? For me, my personal interest was at the time I was working as a news producer for NBC News. So I was covering national news and flying around the country, doing stories every week and really covering a lot of these symptoms on the ground of the Bowling Alone crisis. So no matter what type of community I was going into, whether it was a city, a rural community, east, west, north, south, almost everywhere in America, I was hearing kind of these same worries from citizens. Things aren't working as well in my community as I think they could be. I'm lonely. I don't know my neighbors well. People aren't caring for the institutions in our town as well as I think they could be, including our parks and local libraries. People telling me they were in need of more care. And I felt like the chance to approach Bob and work on this documentary film was a chance to zoom out and not just keep covering those symptoms on the ground. And those symptoms were also playing out in larger ways too. I was also covering things like school shootings and the opioid epidemic, rising suicide numbers. Real indications that, things weren't just off at the community level, but, on the individual level, people were really struggling. And so personally, I just needed a story to grab onto that kind of could point to a little bit of the what's going on here and, more importantly, try to point to what some solutions might be. And so we
Mhm.
approached Bob in 2017. We are coming up, now on almost 9 years ago on that journey. So it's been a long journey. We were in production on the film for about 6 years through, a pandemic also, which, came as a surprise to all of us. Obviously, could not have seen that coming, but, I think raised in the public consciousness, kind of these questions of community and isolation that much more to the forefront.
Mhm.
We released the film in 2023 at the South by Southwest Film Festival in Austin, and have been, touring that film full time for the last 2 years. We've done about 500 or so community screenings
Oh,
as of this
wow.
week, including, this one in Rhode Island would have been one of the stops on that tour. And we're just trying to go library by church basement, by, Rotary Club hall, by coffee shop, around the country, and really try to get this message in front of as many communities as possible who can hopefully use it as a jumping off point for figuring out local solutions.
Yeah, I love that. So, what was it like to do a project of this size with a sibling? That sounds like such a cool, like, full circle moment of growing
Yeah,
up together, going your own ways, and then coming back together.
totally. I think all the things that you would expect, would come with that as well. It was obviously, a joy to get to work with my brother, but family dynamics for anyone that's worked in a family business or done a project with a sibling, you kind of have to surface those pretty early on, to make sure kind of, stuff isn't getting in the way of you also being coworkers. So you're kind of managing that relationship. But yeah, it's total joy to work with my brother, on this project. We had no intention kind of growing up that we would ever work together. He was more in the kind of government civics world, which is how we ended
Mhm.
up taking Robert Putnam's, course in school. I was more in kind of filmmaking, journalism, but, kind of things came together for this project where we were able to really bring together kind of our two interests. And I will say we grew up in a pretty civic town that was, kind of bucking a lot of these decline trends. We grew up in a town in the 1980s and 1990s where, while a lot of the trend lines were going down around the country, our town still had a very vibrant, we grew up in a close suburb of Washington, D.C., a town called Falls Church, Virginia. It was about 10,000 people. And, people were very civically involved. And, we saw the benefits of that. But then as we went out in the world, came to realize that that was not the case for, everyone we were meeting and everywhere we were going. And so I think we were also a little bit, predisposed towards this subject matter,
Mhm.
because that lens had been honed for us at a very early age about the kind of importance of community life.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that the documentary touches on is the importance of that kind of entry point. So you start with a club or you start with some small organization that has ritual to it. And
Mhm.
that's going to break down the barrier of going to a public meeting where you have to encounter Robert's rules or going and watching the legislature or testifying. It creates an easier entry point for those sorts of things. And that's so important because we are all needed for democracy to work well.
Totally. And I think, I really was drawn to that message in a moment coming from the media at that time where increasingly the news stories we were seeing were national. And I think it was getting harder and harder for audiences. I think this remains a crisis in our media right now to feel like there's something they can do to plug in.
And that idea of the news
Yeah,
desert.
totally.
So many places have a news desert. And when you're only hearing national news, it's like, well,
Right.
and you're
Right.
not hearing what your town council is taking up.
Exactly, exactly. And that can leave people feel kind of hopeless and paralyzed with anxiety. And, kind of the message of Bob's work is, well, start with what's happening on your street,
Mhm.
and then so many of the historic, wins that we've seen in our country have started right there. Gather
Yeah.
the people that are around you and see where things can go.
One of my favorite research points that he does in the book is when he starts to do all of that. Oh gosh, I think it was a marketing firm that they gathered data
Yeah,
from.
yeah. DDB Needham.
Yes.
Yep.
On how many dinner parties have you been to? How many picnics have you gone on in the last year? And you guys went to that archive in the documentary. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we in the documentary we went to film with an archive at Cornell University,
Okay.
actually, and yeah, we were able to kind of get into where some of the survey data was that Bob would have worked with in Bowling Alone, and we kind of envision that scene in the film almost like a police procedural in some ways, like going back to the archives and looking through these files and kind of gathering evidence from the scene of the crime. We imagine Bob kind of like this dogged detective, and even use some old kind of detective archival footage in the film, um, because he was really at that time, not a lot of people were talking about a decline in civic life in America. Bob was really one of the first big figures to kind of gain national attention. And it was something that was kind of, revealed to him slowly. He kind of saw a couple data sets at first and was like, this doesn't look great, but, let's see, maybe it's kind of some of these civic participation numbers have shifted. And by the time Bowling Alone came out, that was several years into his kind of initial inquiry, where he, really made an effort to leave no rock unturned as he
Hmm.
like looked in every possible place, from major national archives, that would have been coming out of places like the Labor Department and the Census and Time Diaries, to, as you mentioned, these kind of more obscure data sets that he was able to get from advertising firms that were looking into things like condiment purchasing because they
Right.
wanted to know how many picnics Americans were having per year. And Bob was able to get the picnic data from that advertising research and see that our number of picnics were in decline. So we really want to kind of like pull back the curtain on how is social science done, because these things can kind of seem, they're soft things. They're things like,
Hmm.
how are we having dinner parties with our neighbors? Do we talk to our neighbors? Are we, as I said, going on things like picnics with each other? But we really wanted to show these are measurable things that do show up in the data, and kind of bringing that into awareness, like so many crises, is always the first step
Hmm.
as you then try to move people to action.
And then the photography date archives, those were so
Mhm.
beautiful. And how did you go down those rabbit holes? And how did you decide which to share? And I'm sure you found a whole plethora.
Yeah. So, there were many challenges of narrowing down, in this film. I think at one point we had quote unquote narrowed down Bob's graphs to like 100 graphs. And I said, we have a PowerPoint presentation. This is not a film, because Bob, over the course of his academic career, has compiled just hundreds and hundreds of, pages of data. So, that was one challenge. The next challenge, really was kind of when you are taking on a topic as broad as community life in America. Our editor Chad Irvin, liked to joke, if you got together with another American in the last 200 years, you were fair game for this film. So he was just drowning in a wealth of archival footage, which is in some ways a wonderful thing in a documentary. Many documentaries, they're having a hard time finding enough coverage. We had
Hmm.
way too much, so we kind of had the opposite problem of there was so much incredible stuff, kind of how to narrow it down. And a lot of that was a credit to our editor. And we also had this great archival producer, Rebecca Kent, who helped us kind of just comb through all of these archives around the country. But, we really wanted for, most Americans, we knew we would undoubtedly in an hour and a half miss something, but we
Hmm.
wanted try our best to at least have, one piece of footage that if an American was watching this film, they could see something that they could grab onto, that they might see themselves in.
Cool.
So really trying to kind of cast as wide of a net as possible of all the different kind of incredible ways that Americans have come together. Um, in the time that we've been kind of documenting that in photographs and in video.
Very cool. So, one of the interesting things that I love about this idea of the importance of community engagement and social capital and coming together is, and then it's now a documentary, is that there are fewer things that bring us together more than storytelling.
Mm.
And this like ability to connect with each other. So you have people who are having this shared experience by watching this documentary, which is really just like a piece of art and through storytelling. And so, and then to flip that on its head, it takes such a big team to create a
Yeah.
documentary. And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
came at it from the aspect of the theater world. And the first time I was in a production where we had a professional light designer. And then all of a sudden the entire feeling changes.
Yeah.
And so thinking about your vision as director and producer, and then you have this animator come in and bring these archival photos and video and charts and graphs to life in a new way that you haven't experienced before. And how does that shared community project come together? And like, and I'm sure there are aspects of this that go unnoticed because it's just so seamless for the viewer.
Totally, totally. Some of the most emotional moments for me when I was getting to see the film on the big screen for the first time ended up being like when our credits would roll at the end, for that reason, because, probably over 200 or 300 hands touched this film. When we get down to the fact that we had, an original score written and then performed. So there are like multiple oboes credited on, our credits, because we were able to get an orchestra to record the score of our film that our incredible composer, Chad Cannon, composed. So we were lucky to have an original score made, where he was really able to draw on this kind of Americana tradition too, in the music to really bring it to life in that way. As you mentioned, our animator, Mark Lopez, who, for anyone who hasn't seen the film, he does this very kind of collage-y style of animation where he uses a lot of photo cutouts. But what that meant is in any given piece of his animation, there may be 100 different photos that have been cut out and put together. And so, that also meant that many more archives that we kind of were crediting, in the film, who we would have been kind of getting in touch with their local archivist to kind of help us get that, image cleared, even if it was just a tiny cutout of, one little swimmer that kind of was in the corner of a frame. And then also just the number of kind of helpful, associate producers and producers that were helping us just pull together all the spreadsheets of all that information. But that, this was probably most certainly the largest team, I had worked on until this point in my career. And it was such a beautiful part of this project. The last thing I'll say too, we feature 6 community groups in the film around the country. And we made a point to try to not just fly in kind of one camera person to all of those places, but to work with local crew in each of those communities so that the story was being told by people from the places where we were filming. Which was an important thing to us, but also, a challenge because it meant we had to find new crew in every single city where we went to film with community groups. And it meant that many more kind of hands and camera people were kind of touching the film and kind of bringing their unique perspective to the project. So one of my favorite things to talk about is our team. So thank you for that question.
That's amazing. So we have this beautiful community on this side that tells the story of the importance of community engagement. And then we all get to have this collective experience together. And I think that's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. And then, what I think the third part of it is, I kind of consider this a piece of, there's this kind of theory of practice in art called socially engaged art. And I consider this film, we have attempted to make it something that's a socially engaged piece of art where Pete and I consider the film just half of the puzzle. The other half is the unknown that every community decides to do after they watch a screening. And we feel like they are really kind of completing the other half of this civic art project by then deciding to go out and start a group in their town or launch a new club or association. And that is kind of the phase that we've been in these last 2 years. And the stories that we hear about those projects that are sparked by the film, have just been, incredible for Pete and I to kind of hear all of the creative directions that people end up going in. And, was our exact hope for how the film could hopefully, just be a jumpstart in that direction.
Of course. Yeah. So are you a joiner? Are you?
I am, yeah. And I think that was another thing that predisposed, Pete and I to work on this project, our kind of community life, not just in our town growing up, but then as we went out into the world, we really always sought that out, either by starting organizations ourselves or joining organizations. Over the course of making the film, I was organizing a union with my coworkers at NBC News. We
Oh,
were
cool.
organizing about 200 of us with the News Guild in New York and won that union. So that
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. But so, I was seeing the real life data though, play out even as I was working on the film. At that point, I was working on the film like nights and weekends. I hadn't quit my job yet, but I was seeing how hard it was to get our coworkers out to meetings, after work. We were not in that kind of practice of flexing those muscles. That would have been much more common, 4 or 5 decades ago, that people were attending, meetings either with their coworkers or community members many nights per week. But
Yeah.
this was kind of a new thing for a lot of us. And then I was also and remain a member of several professional associations of video producers that really helped. Were just more hands helping us get this film across the finish line, even in small ways. I needed advice. Where can I rent a camera in Houston, Texas? And I could drop that question into
Hmm.
a chat with this group, the Video Consortium that I'm a member of, and get a trusted response from them. So was definitely kind of seeing that what I now know is quote unquote social capital, at work,
Right.
in my life, the kind of technical term for the ease and trust and reciprocity that comes from kind of having those close bonds.
Yeah, that's awesome. Um, so tell me a little bit about Join 101, the next phase of this project.
Yeah, so we are coming up now. We have been touring the film full time since March of 2023. So we're about now almost more like 2.5 years in on this tour, and we felt like our film attempted to tackle this question of what is going on, and you know what are kind of these trends, and like why are they happening, so kind of like the what and the why of the crisis. But we've been getting a lot of questions about the how do we now go from here. We understand that social capital is in decline, and we might understand from your film why this is important for our democracy and our physical health. Hopefully, if we were successful in getting that across in 90 minutes. But there is this larger question of what do we do from here. And so, starting the new year, my brother Pete and I are launching a new project called Join 101. It's going to live at join101.org. And we are going to be just, posting a ton of resources there for, how to do kind of good joining practices, how to run better meetings, how to host a joining fair, which is something we've been kind of working with a lot of communities around the country to kind of get out all their clubs and host joining fairs to kind of get people to sign up. How to do a civic census of your community and kind of see how you're measuring up to things like, third spaces and, meeting halls for your clubs and associations. We'll be sharing kind of more examples from American civic history that people can hopefully get inspired by. And then most importantly, and I think most exciting, for us, we have just gotten this wealth of stories of this burst of civic energy that we really are seeing around the country right now. And we really want to highlight those stories of people that we've met on the tour that are starting really cool initiatives. So we'll also be kind of doing a weekly newsletter out of Join 101 where we'll be featuring clubs and organizations that have been kind of getting off the ground and trying to turn around these trends. That can hopefully, inspire others with their own ideas or, copycat projects in other cities. So if you have any, send them our way. We would love to feature them. And I'm sure there are many.
Yeah, what's been most surprising for you as you've embarked on this journey?
Yeah, I think to be totally honest, I went into this film in a dark place. I had been seeing a lot of really hard stuff around the country. And, I wasn't just working in the news like every other American. I was also like living in the headlines because I was spending just tons of time, on my cell phone, working around large TV screens, that were doing kind of 24-hour news cycle. And a lot of what I was seeing, were not great stories about what was going on in our country. And I do not want to also downplay any of the very serious crises that our country is facing right now. But I headed into the film wanting to convince Americans, that we could turn things around, and, wanting to feature groups that were trying to turn around these trends, but still kind of unsure if I myself, would come around on that. Going through the motions a little bit. But I can say, fully kind of 7 years in, 8, 9 years in on this project now, I am feeling very hopeful about where we go from here. And, my brother and I have been lucky enough that in touring this film, we are living in a totally alternative news bubble of, all these incredible things that are happening around this country right now. Our hope with Join 101 is to highlight more of those stories. And I just, generally, would love to just see more of those stories kind of getting airtime for all of our communities, because I do think it is easier to motivate people to action from a place of inspiration than from a place of anxiety, where someone's throwing up their hands and saying, "What can I do about this? This problem is too overwhelming."
Joy is a very important part of being able to participate and do anything and motivate and come together. And that's really,
Yeah.
and come together with people who aren't just like me.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and there's, really interesting, data out there around people doing something now tend to have a more positive outlook on things being able to get better than those that are just kind of, sitting at home and kind of passively consuming inspiration. So there's something about that, starting to act that gives you kind of greater sense than that things can be overcome and solved, and that sense of agency.
Nice. What would you recommend for someone who says that they'd like to get involved in a community organization, but they don't know where to start?
Yeah, I think, this kind of speaks to, we're hearing this a lot in the film, is I want to get involved. I don't know where to find out about what's happening. And, this is this great irony of this moment where we have tons of information, right at our fingertips, but it can be very hard to find out what's just happening down the street from you. So one thing that I just encourage everyone to do as we've been touring the film is, if you are sharing things on your social media right now, can you do an assessment and see how many of those things am I sharing are stories that are happening close to me, where someone can actually get plugged in to what's happening? Because we can all play a role in kind of the news that's being spread to our community. So, start looking for those local stories, start sharing those local stories, and then go to the institutions that, remain, who are keeping this information. So I'll use this as a chance to shout out our local libraries, which, are truly transforming into this moment beyond just our repositories for books, really important community hubs of civic information. So, if you can't find anything, kind of combing, local media, head over to your local library or your local town hall and try to find out what's happening. If there's an independent coffee shop in your town that has a bulletin board, head over there, see if anything is hung up. Put a call out to your friends. Hey, I want to get involved. I'm looking to find out what's available here. Does anyone know? So that you're then not in that search to get, alone. Could you start searching together for things to get involved in? And then, I also remind people too, you might not like the first thing that you sign up for. It's important to kind of try out a lot of different organizations and see what's a good fit. Because the thing that's going to actually make you come back, is if it's something that like lights you on fire. It's not going to be something where you feel like you're going and you're getting, extra credit at life and feeling like you've pat on the back. I've done a good job.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. That is kind of wrapping up a lot of my questions.
Great.
Is there anything that I didn't ask that you like to talk about?
Sure. I can do one add on to that last question if you want it, and you can kind of take it
Perfect.
or leave it if I'm blabbing too much. But,
No, this is great.
one kind of simple question, we tell a lot of people to ask themselves is, What are you doing alone right now that you could be doing together? And that can be a great starting point. So if you're cooking alone, could you start a supper club? If you're reading alone, could you start a book club? If you're walking alone, can you start a walking club? If you're raising kids on your own and feeling stretched thin, could you start a babysitting co-op and get to know some of the other neighbors on your block? So a lot of folks, also feel stretched for time. This type of questioning is a way that you can ask, what are you already doing in your life? So you don't necessarily need to kind of create, more time for it. Just kind of figure out how can you incorporate more of a communal aspect into the things that you're already doing. And go from there. Some kind of cool examples of that we've seen kind of as we've been touring the film. There was this daddy stroller club that started in Brooklyn a couple years ago. And it was just a new dad who said, I'm walking my kid on my own. Why don't I try to do it with 20 other dads? And now these, stroller clubs have been kind of popping up all over the country. Simple as taking your kid out for a walk. We had a group in San Francisco we heard about that started I think it was called Tuesday Night TV Club or something. It was literally just getting together to watch TV, something, statistically Americans are spending many hours of their day doing because, we know some of the data about that. Your average American consumes about 5 hours of television a day. But are you consuming those hours alone? Could you invite a couple of friends over and then, you're having a chat, afterwards and kind of building friendships. And you haven't even had to, leave your living room necessarily. Yeah.
Or change your routine at all.
Right. Exactly. So that's a great place to kind of start.
I love that. I love that, starting from doing just an inventory of what am I doing by myself already.
Exactly. Yep.
I think that's awesome. We do dinner with our neighbors a couple times a week because we have to make dinner anyway. My husband always makes more food than we would possibly eat, so they just come over.
I love that. Yep. It's a great example.
Yeah. Oh, I think I love that a lot. So we wrap up every show with a segment called The Last Chapter, where we talk about a library or bookish related question.
Okay.
People love to ask librarians what their favorite book is, which I think is so boring.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a book that you hated?
Ooh. Let me look. I have my bookshelf of all my unread books that I.
If this helps, I really hate The Giving Tree so much.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, maybe okay. I'll try to do one for a hater. There was that kind of popular book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I think that genre of book that kind of brings professional gain into kind of our personal lives. There's a tendency in our culture where the capitalist ethos is so baked into the American founding story that it can kind of seep into all aspects of our life. And so, I see that book as kind of representative of that kind of genre where kind of people are kind of more seen as pawns to kind of professional gain. And I think in the service of our community life, it's really important that we learn how to kind of separate those fears and understand that there's a whole other world waiting for us outside of our jobs, where there's a whole other world to be built.
Yeah.
Where our friends and neighbors don't need to be necessarily influenced and won over for personal gain, but kind of shared collaborators on co-creating our lives together.
I don't need to have transactional relationships with everyone.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
A little hate for Dale Carnegie.
Thank you for going along with that one for me.
Yep.
Great. That's all I have for you.
Great. Lovely chat, Meg.
Yeah. I loved the documentary so much.
Thank you.
I did get to see Dr. Putnam speak last spring, which was really fun.
Was he in Rhode Island for an event?
Yeah, he came to the Pell Center at Salve Regina University, and It was really cool. I think my favorite aspect of that was someone asked him about social media.
Yeah.
And is it good or bad? And
Yeah.
ultimately he said that it's an alloy.
Yep.
And I absolutely loved that.
Yeah, these are tools, and they can be, used to bond us closer together or break us further apart. Unfortunately, though, a lot of the numbers about how we're actually spending time on this quote unquote social media is just consuming videos.
Exactly.
Some of that data has come out now, and it's very high. Something like 90% of our time spent on Instagram is just watching video. So
Yeah.
we're not using that to have as many chats as we would like to hope that are setting up community meetings, but
No,
it is
right.
there when we want to.
I mean, at the same time, like my brothers and I have a Civic chat on Instagram where we just pebble each other of like,
Yeah.
and so there is a benefit to that. It's not isolation.
Yes.
And going back to your comment about like TV club and like this idea of like watching TV together, and that there's studies out there that show that TV is not bad for preschoolers, but the way for it to be not bad is they watch it with a grown-up.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about it through there's studies around like watching Sesame Street and the benefit, the educational benefits with that.
Yeah.
So I think it all comes down to intentionality.
Yes, exactly. This kind of space in our life is going to need, I think, that much more intentionality kind of going forward as tech continues to, just have such a large capture on our time and on our work and on our home life.
Yeah. And as things are fighting for our attention.
Yes. Yeah.
So one thing I forgot to ask is, where can people watch the documentary?
Yeah. So if you head to joinordiefilm.com, we have a list up of the next stops on the Join Up tour. So we continue to host, work with community partners to host community screenings around the country. There's several kind of happening every week. So if you go to joinordiefilm.com, you can see kind of where the film might be stopping next. If you don't see a stop coming to your town, there's also a host a screening button on our website. So you can click on that and fill out a request to kind of get more info about how to host a screening. That is our favorite way for people to see the film together in community. But if you'd like to, catch it first, but, at home before kind of going and hosting your own event, you can also watch it on Netflix.
Well, great. Thank you so much for joining us. This was awesome.
Yeah, great to chat, Meg.
Great to chat. Nice to meet you. And I look forward to seeing what Join 101 does.
Yeah, and we're excited to see what clubs start in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you for joining me, and thank you everyone for listening. If you'd like to share a book you hated or just reach out to the show, send us an email at overdoingitpod@gmail.com or find us on Instagram at overdoingitpod. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help us reach more Rhode Islanders. Overdoing It is proud to be a resident partner of the Rhode Island Center for the Book and is brought to you by library staff and community members all around the Ocean State. The project has been funded in part by the Rhode Island Office of Library and Information Services. Thank you again for listening, and this has been another episode of Overdoing It, the Rhode Island Library Podcast. We're overdoing it, but you're doing just fine.